Under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire reached the peak of its power. The empire expanded through a multitude of wars. So what could go wrong? Ottoman succession was not as clear as in Europe, where the lines of heritage left no questions open about who was the rightful ruler. In the Ottoman dynasty, this was very different. Succession was a matter of life and death. Let's investigate the life of an Ottoman prince. An Ottoman prince grew up in his father's house and, before he was confined to the palace from around 1600, went out to a provincial posting, usually upon puberty and after being circumcised, when he took his first steps to adulthood. He was now a district governor. At his graduation from the palace, his father the Sultan gave the prince his initial household out of the imperial palace. The occasion was not really a graduation for the palace people assigned to the prince. On the contrary, they might feel that they were demoted from the secure existence of the palace to an unsure future with one of the princes. The future of the prince and his retinue was unsecure because of a particular Ottoman tradition. Nevertheless, in the inner Asian tradition, all the sons of the ruler were eligible for the throne, and as such during the lifetime of the father, they all were assigned banner commands when they came of age to prepare them for the struggle against their brothers, and eventual accession as the ruler if they won. To prepare the child prince for the inevitable showdown and possible reign, he was assigned a statesman as tutor. Such a showdown had some risk for the Sultan's son. In the Ottoman case, probably not deliberately, but as a result of ad hoc response to historical situations, the ruling family was able to keep succession from father to one of his sons. The son who won, either through political acumen or military prowess, then killed his brothers and the sons. There were no more nephews and cousins. We heard about one such historical situation when, after the Battle of Kosovo, the new Sultan Bayezid killed his brother Jacob in order to get rid of a potential rival. This was the first fratricide in the Ottoman dynasty. It was necessary since only a prince of Ottoman lineage could lay claim to become Sultan. The imperial house became a quasi-sacred family, and this myth preserved the lives of several ultimate heirs, even in periods of degeneracy. Hence, also the rule that princes must be killed without shedding their blood. They had to be strangled. It was believed that the blood contained a magic force which could be used malevolently by their enemies. The killing of brothers became a common thing after the Battle of Kosovo, and a close member of a prince's household could share the fate of his master. But in any case, the people were imperial property, so to speak. If their prince eventually won the throne struggle, they would come back to Topkapi in his retinue. Even if he lost, they would not be punished unless they were in the prince's inner circle. They would be taken back to the imperial fold. All of this sheds new light on the education and the positioning of princes in centers of command. We just learned that succession led to an influx of the companions of the new sultan into the imperial palace. This became important after the death of Suleiman, although usually a prince's household was small in contrast to the number of people inhabiting the Topkapi. The numbers involved were not even close. There were tens of thousands attached to Topkapi, whereas the prince's initial household numbered around 500. But this describes only the general situation, and of course, where general rules are, there are special exceptions too. One such exception had to do with the sons of Suleiman the Magnificent. Suleiman ruled the Ottoman Empire for 46 years, longer than any other sultan, and led his army on 13 campaigns to the frontiers of his domains. No wonder he was called Suleiman the Magnificent, but this magnificent period ended in 1566. 4 hours before dawn on September 7th, Suleiman died under the walls of the fortress of Szigetvar in southern Hungary, which his army had been besieging for a month. Szigetvar fell the next day and the area to the south of Lake Balaton was occupied. The Sultan is dead. Long live the Sultan. But who could be the Sultan? To answer this, let's find out more about his sons. Suleiman had his surviving sons by 2 consorts and probably some more by 15 other concubines. First there was Mahidevran, also called Gulbahar. There are a lot of theories about her origins, but for us it is only relevant that she gave birth to Mustafa in 1515. Then there was Hürrem, more commonly known as Roxolana. She had two surviving and relatively able sons, Selim in 1524 and Bayezid in 1525. So for a start, let's find out what happened to Mustafa. In 1553, Suleiman's eldest son, Prince Mustafa, was executed in his late 30s. The official reason for Mustafa's execution was that he was planning to usurp the throne, but blame was laid at the door of Hürrem Sultan. What is described here in such a sober way actually is a story full of intrigues. I'm going to present some quotes by Gerhard Schweitzer, although his book on the Janissaries is very story-like and includes neither footnotes nor sources. Hürrem attracted attention and even European envoys knew about her. At court there was talk that Suleiman made no decision without consulting his wife Hürrem. Roxolana was described as a red-haired Russian with a charming smile. Although she probably was the person with the closest ties to the Sultan, her children posed problems, since Mustafa, who was not her son, showed to be much more promising than her own children. The Crown Prince was a handsome and energetic man, known to be an excellent commander and able to handle the rough Janissaries. Mustafa seemed to be the image of his father, a promise to become a second Suleiman, taking care of the empire. On the other hand, there were Roxolana's own sons, especially Selim, the elder of the two. Selim was a cumbersome, plump person, a youth with a red and bloated face, showing the unrestrained drunkard, a weak and undecided man, leaving decisions to his mother. It is obvious that Roxolana, having the fratricidal customs of Ottoman succession in mind, feared for her sons. The legends go that Hürrem plotted and convinced her husband that his son Mustafa, with the help of the Janissaries, planned to take over power and force Suleiman to abdicate, just like he had done to his father. In the end, Suleiman made a decision. During a campaign against Persia, he called his son to his tent. There, 7 mutes with shaved heads waited, but the Sultan himself was hiding behind a curtain. Mustafa hurried to a purple curtain at the front of the tent, since he knew his father was hidden behind it. The mutes hurried after him and held him. Mustafa called for the Sultan, insisted on his innocence, but behind the curtain there only was silence. Seconds later, a sling was around his neck, and after a minute, all was over. The Janissaries, who supported Mustafa, screamed bloody murder, but did not dare to rise since the preferred successor to the throne was already dead. I'm not going to judge if the stories about Roxolana are true. Fact is that after this filicide there were only 2 sons left, Selim and Bayezid. Both eyed each other with suspicion. Although a lot of Suleiman's sons were already dead, 2 brothers were by far enough to cause conflict. At least they had the same powerful mother, but this did not keep peace for long, for Hürrem died in 1558. Suleiman had to find his own way to deal with his 2 potential successors. Suleiman, apparently fearing a coup, sent Bayezid and Selim to govern distant provinces. Selim was transferred from his favorable appointment in Manisa to Konya, further from Istanbul. Bayezid was moved from his post as military commander at Edirne to Amasya, where Prince Mustafa had been before him. This measure was meant to bring peace and keep the brothers geographically apart and at a considerable distance from Istanbul, as we can see on the map. Bayezid's new command was further away from Istanbul than Selim's. This means in the case of Suleiman's death, he was in a bad position to be the first to reach Istanbul and take the throne. This left him with one option only. 5 years later, the younger of the 2 remaining princes, Bayezid, feared that his older brother Selim was more advantageously positioned in his provincial posting for a quick dash to Istanbul at the death of Suleiman, now well advanced in years and suffering from gout and possibly other infirmities. Perceiving his position as negative, Bayezid decided that rebellion would be his only chance to get out of the succession struggle alive. Bayezid understood that the contest to succeed Suleiman had begun in earnest, and, as he crossed northern Anatolia to Amasya, attracted to his side an army of the disaffected, provincial cavalrymen and irregulars, as well as tribesmen of southeast Anatolia, numbering some thousands of men, many of whom had been partisans of his brother Mustafa. There might have been a reason why Bayezid, actually the favorite of his mother Roxolana, did not believe his father's impartiality towards his sons. Shortly after the murder of Mustafa, a pretender arose in the Balkans and Bayezid was suspected of having instigated this rebellion. But there was one big difference between Bayezid and Mustafa. Bayezid did not manage to get the Janissaries' support. He had to rely on other troops. During the dynastic struggles of the Ottoman princes under Bayezid II and Suleiman I, the prince, who was unable to secure the support of the reigning sultan and the central standing troops, recruited thousands of landless peasants, townsfolk, nomads and vagrant irregular soldiers. Referred to as daily wages after the salary, these militiamen were ordinary tax-paying subjects. They volunteered for military service in order to eventually join the ranks of the sultan's salary troops, and thereby entered the privileged, tax-exempt Askari class. The process reached its peak under Suleiman, when Prince Bayezid, whom Sultan Suleiman declared a rebel, reportedly recruited 10,000 daily wagers, pledging to enlist them into the Janissary Corps. Suleiman sided with Selim, since Bayezid revolted openly. He ordered the Anatolian troops to mobilize and sent some household troops. In addition, Selim resorted to the same strategy as his brother and recruited every peasant who would join him. The two brothers finally met at Konya in 1559 to discuss the succession by military force. The opposing armies met near Konya, Selim's the larger and better equipped. On the second day, Bayezid fled the field towards Amasya, where he still commanded support. Despite the peace agreed with the Sultan in 1555, Shah Tahmasp offered him asylum in Iran. In 1562, the Shah finally succumbed, agreeing to trade Bayezid and his sons for quantities of gold coin and sumptuous gifts. But before this could happen, they were murdered at Tahmasp's capital of Qazvin by a trusted henchman of Selim, and their bodies handed over instead. In stark contrast to the posthumous favor shown to his elder brother Mehmed, the rebel Bayezid and his sons were buried outside the walls of the provincial Anatolian town of Sivas. With this, the succession was clear, since only one brother was left. Selim, maybe the least able of the three brothers, came out victoriously. The battles which determined the next sultan were fought. Surely this solved all problems. Or did it? When Suleiman finally died in 1574, at the age of 72, while besieging Szigetvar in Hungary, Selim hurried to Istanbul to become the new sultan before another revolt could happen. Now it was up to him to make good on his promises made to all the recruited peasants. To a certain degree, this problem was already taken care of, since at the Battle of Konya 8,000 soldiers died. But there were still thousands left who demanded their due, and only so many of them could find employment in the palace. One way of paying back the Anatolian conscripts and volunteers was to give them timars. These were fiefs and thereby posed a claim to draw resources from a certain area. Under Selim II, the predominance of the sons of timar holders was lost, but that of the sons of nobodies was reinforced. In the registers of this period, sons of timar holders dropped to 20%, while sons of nobodies increased to 61%. 61% is the highest number of so-called nobodies ever reached under the classical timar system. Compared to the time of Suleiman, this was achieved by not granting the timars to the sons of earlier holders. This underlines the thesis that Selim II had to pay random peasants who fought for him and used the bestowal of timars to do so. In addition, during his reign, Selim handed out the most timars annually. In his 8 years as Sultan, he gave away 11 timars per year on average. This is by far more than any other Sultan before him. Before Selim II, Murad II had the next highest average with 3.13 timars per year. There was a very good reason for this decision. Since scores of Timurid cavalrymen also sided with the rebel prince, the government could not trust them to perform the traditional function of maintaining law and order in the Anatolian countryside. But there still were thousands of conscripts whom Selim brought to Istanbul. This probably was necessary to shift the balance of power in his favor, since the Janissaries were known to become unruly on the accession of a new sultan. And this is where we come to the point why this episode is so important for the Janissaries. Accession to the throne was the time for promotions, salary increases and graduation to independent revenue grant. How was the prince going to accommodate both the imperial household and his Anatolian men? The Janissaries were especially incensed after hearing that these conscripts had already been housed in the barracks while in Istanbul. The Janissaries' arrogance is passed down by a report with the following words. That uncouth lot who accompanied the prince should not mingle with us, or else we will kill them like dogs. It came to conflict, and even some Anatolians were killed. In the end, Selim promised everyone to pay whatever they wanted, but his problems grew even bigger. Selim's recruits were ex-peasants. Provincial revenue grant holders in the army recognized some of them among the sultan's men, some indeed now grant holders themselves. They demanded peasant dues from such men as being their registered peasants. Selim promised to pay them the dues from some other source, and, at all, he was only following his father's orders. Selaniki notes that the palace personnel given to a prince when he first went out to provincial office normally returned to positions in the palace when the prince succeeded. In Selim's case, the historian adds, 350 men went out of the palace, but 8,000 loutish, unskilled men came to Istanbul with him, many of them no better than thugs. This was the first time that instead of deaf shamis, a lot of people employed in the palace were Anatolian Muslims. Although the Sekban we are talking about here are not the Sekban which are part of the Janissary organization we discussed in an earlier video, many peasants were still incorporated into the Janissary Corps. This led to another expansion of the household troops, which is also reflected in military spending. While in 1548 19.2 million akçes were spent on the Janissaries, in 1568 they received 34.2 million. This is an increase by nearly 80%. But what happened to all those peasants on the losing side, or those who did not obtain a position financed by the state? While about 8,000 soldiers perished in the Battle of Konya between the competing armies and the government persecuted Bayezid's men in the purges following the rebel prince's execution, many of his Levant soldiers escaped. Forming bands of 50 to 60 men, they roamed the countryside as bandits. To re-establish public order, Istanbul sent Janissaries to towns and villages in increasing numbers. Settled in the countryside as guardians, these Janissaries supplemented the salaries by collecting fees for transgression, a function and privilege traditionally belonging to the Timurid provincial cavalry, and by establishing businesses in towns and acquiring farmlands in villages. After this, other rebellions served as reason to send further forces into the countryside. Those forces financed themselves by collecting fees, which sounds like a very polite description for corruption. The results were as expected. The disorder increased and the Janissaries out there mixed up with ordinary taxpayers so that it was nearly impossible to tell who was and who was not a Janissary. And this is a good place to stop and take a look at what we learned today. A big part of this episode was dedicated to Ottoman princes and succession. A prince would grow up in the palace and receive an education. But soon enough he would get his own household and occupy an office in some province. There he had to prove himself. At the death of his father, this experience would come in handy since through intrigues as well as military force, the brothers would battle out the succession. Only the winner would survive and bring his household back to the Topkapi. A special succession struggle occurred under Suleiman the Magnificent. Through intrigues of Hürrem, more commonly known as Roxolana, only her sons survived. One of them, Bayezid, unwisely decided to rebel and raised a peasant army in Anatolia. His brother Selim did the same and finally won the throne with the support of his father. After Suleiman's death, Selim, although considered weak by many scholars, succeeded peacefully since he was the only son left. Selim's problem was that he made a lot of promises to the peasants he recruited during the civil war against his brothers. At the enthronement, thousands of them demanded their payment, and the Janissaries, who knew a weak sultan when they saw one, did the same. In the end, Selim could not pay them all, but handed out lucrative offices instead. Positions in the corps of the Janissaries became available too, and suddenly they were Muslim-born soldiers in a corps otherwise made up by Christian-born and converted boys. Bayezid's army, although defeated, did not simply disband. They had nowhere to go and therefore roamed the countryside as bandits. In order to counter the remainders of his brother's campaign, Selim sent Janissaries to regain control. And now it is your turn again. To me, the talk about the intrigues and the praising of Mustafa seems like a soap opera. Do you have sources providing a more realistic account of the occurrences? Tell me in the comments. Please do not forget to like, share and subscribe. So long, we'll meet again soon. Stay critical, stay curious, stay free.